Okay, the meeting will come to order. It's Thursday, March 6th, and this is our policy committee meeting. The first policy up is policy 5450.1, notification of sex offenders and access to school property. Does anyone have any questions on this one? Ray?
Thank you, Madam President. This is for this policy and all other of our locally adjusted policies. Have these been vetted by David or other legal counsel, all these changes that we're making?
Yes.
Including the ones that were just added, I guess, today or whatever? That's include the voting policy and everything else?
Those were added at the last policy meeting.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else? Victoria?
I think this is a question for the committee. What is, for this notification of sex offenders, we are changing the title of it to say notification of sex offenders and access to school property. My question to the members is, what is the opposition to what we have changed?
Victoria, could you restate that?
Yeah, I just want to have a discussion around the actual policy because we did make changes. Again, the biggest change that we made on here is that we will follow this unless required by law. And we took out the decision-making process for an exception. So I'm just wondering why there would be anything negative to say about that.
Margot, would you know?
And we added that if anybody, I'm sorry. If anyone happens to observe someone on school grounds who is a paroled sex offender, it tells you that they should notify their supervisor or the building principal so that, everybody can be made aware.
Right, so the reason that these proposed changes were made was to make it safer for the students in our district. I just want to make that clear. This was not to single-handedly take someone out of this process. It's just that the way the verbiage was before, it left room for discretion, and I believe that there should be no discretion unless required by law. So I want to make that clear. So I'd like to make a motion to bring this to the full board at the next meeting.
Sorry, Ray. Go ahead.
Thank you, Madam President. I imagine that was directed towards me because I have been in opposition changing this policy in the past. We have already discussed this policy numerous times, brought it up numerous times. It's not passed numerous times. We are consistent with New York State law, as I understand, via David, and I do not see a reason, because there has not been an issue in Newburgh with this. We've already been briefed on this several times. David's brought it up that we're consistent with New York State policy, and I do not see the need to take that power away from our superintendent when there's provisions on how that's done. It's not just, hey, come on in anytime you want. It's actually discussions that are held with, they have to request permission through their parole officer. Superintendent will confer with legal and the parole officer to decide when it's applicable and when it's not. And that's the only reason why I'm opposed to it, is because we're consistent with New York State policy.
My personal opinion is we need to do everything we can in a preventive way to limit liability to the district. So I'm in favor of this. I would like to move it forward. Okay, so. Go ahead, Ms. Peterson.
There was also a concern that was brought up. I know some of the language was changed. And I don't know if it's something that we're doing moving forward, but there's provisions about instructions of students that are falling within that category. I don't know if that has been resolved. That was another concern that was brought to legal and to the board from my vantage point.
To my knowledge, that was all addressed so that they could participate remotely in learning.
Or otherwise, if if required to do so.
Right, but the students are for the staff. So the provision of not students participating, but the staff providing.
What was the last part of what you just said?
So there's a provision in the current policy that states that our recommended change is that if students fall within this category, they will participate in virtual instruction. We don't have, I don't think, we don't have current language. So I was wondering if that is something that needs to be looked at. I think it's something that I brought up previously with legal.
No, I haven't heard that before. It basically says we will do whatever we're required to do by the law.
Can I, in this policy, it states, if a student is a registered sex offender, they will be offered remote learning to fulfill their educational requirements unless otherwise required by law.
I will put it in writing to the board because it's not something that should be discussed on the floor.
Does anyone else want to add anything? Okay, so we'll, Dr. Bourne.
I do want to say, as acting superintendent, I agree with this change in policy, as I want to ensure that we protect our students in our schools.
Then I'd like to make a motion to bring this to the board on March 11th for a second read and vote.
And do I have a second? I'll be a second. We'll move this. Oh, roll call. Victoria?
Yes.
I'm a yes.
No.
Bergerelli, Mr. Bergerelli, okay. So, okay. It's this one. Okay. The next policy is Policy 2105, School Board Access to Information and Reports. So, okay, this policy basically says that any major incidents on school property, that the board is notified as soon as practicable, but not more than 48 hours from the incident. Anyone wish to make any changes or have any concerns? Ms. Boucher?
I would like to ask Mr. Bear, because he had a concern at the last regular meeting. I'm not sure if it was clarified that this policy is to inform the board, not the public. So if we can just elaborate, because you were discussing communicable diseases and the CDC.
Thank you. So I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this again. So again, I have no interest in keeping anything from anybody. I just pointed out a number of times that we have to communicate to the Department of Health things that occur. We have reports that go up. COVID was the most obvious example of that. We had to give daily reports. We had a portal that we had to put things in. So that time has now passed, but we have influenza. There are reports that we send on a routine basis to the Department of Health. But it's for them to decide really when you're talking about an outbreak. We don't really get to make that decision. I'm going to try to speak carefully, but one of the things that occurs is that what the Department of Health has recently experienced are what they call breakthrough infections. I don't know what the right word is, where students have been immunized and yet are still getting the thing they were immunized against. And we've asked, and they're contagious potentially. And we, sorry, what?
In process?
They were immunized.
Yes, they're partially
As an
immunized.
example, I'm immunized for measles. I have a breakthrough case where I get measles. That is a very rare example. It's starting to happen again. And then the question becomes, am I responsible to communicate that out to even you when that's really under the jurisdiction of the Department of Health? In that particular example, Department of Health told us that that is not a reportable incident to anyone. So I don't like having to be the one to make judgment on whether I'm withholding and who am I listening to and to what level am I allowed to communicate that out. I understand the board's role in maintaining confidentiality, but I'm just giving you that as an example of something that was a very real example where we were specifically told you do not report this. This is not a reportable incident. So it's putting me in a difficult position to know when is the right time in spite of what direction I might be getting from the Department of Health. And the last thing I want to do is have you feel like something was, let's say that played out and suddenly it went from a single incident to suddenly there was an outbreak, whatever, because we now have, even though we are in New York State require all kids to come to school immunized, there might be changes in policy at the federal level. I don't, suddenly an outbreak and then you feel like I withheld, I don't ever want that to happen. Those are somewhat hypotheticals at this point, but it's just an example of where I don't like to play God in these kinds of examples, and that's why we defer to the experts in those cases.
So I'm glad to hear that, only because what I heard you say, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that you are reporting to somebody and having that conversation at the state level. So I'm perfectly okay, and the committee can talk about it, in removing that line as long as you're telling me that you are having those conversations with the State Department of Health and you are doing that part of it.
I think, again, I have no issue with trying to find the language that fits your need. So maybe report outbreaks as communicated to us by the Department of Health. Another example I'll give, I've had a lot of examples. I lose track of the diseases we deal with, but what's the one? There's one that shows up a lot. It'll come to me where schools have gotten just ridden with it. It's highly contagious. It's not bad. A lot of kids get it. I'm going to lose track. I used to have a school in my previous district that routinely every year. No, it's a childhood influenza kind of thing, and you have to literally scrub the school, right? You got to shut the school down. You got to scrub it, right? It's not pertussis. It'll come to me what it is. You should but you should know that, right? If we're going to take those extraordinary measures that we're being told by the Department of Health that we need to close the school and clean the school before we can let kids reenter, of course. But that's coming from them, not from me. So I don't mind the language if it says something that, as per Department of Health directive, as determined by the Department of Health.
I'll add it as determined by the Department of Health.
Okay, but then how would that apply to other types of incidents of violence or?
It doesn't. It's only to diseases, communicable diseases, contagious diseases, infectious diseases.
So I can
Apply to that one particular phrase.
So I can attest to, when it comes to certain diseases, a lot of these are reported to the Department of Health and they come back as a number, not an actual name. So again, I believe there's a percentage to where, like, let's say if 25% of the student population were to have it, that is when something is required to happen by law. So I understand that part of it. I also believe as long as we have someone from administration that is in contact with someone at the Department of Health, as Mr. Bear is, I trust that he does that part of it. I don't believe that he would hold anything from the board, but again, timeline for this is difficult, especially with exposure periods. Those differ for various diseases. So I do understand that, which is why thank you for coming, Mr. Bear. So,
can I just make one other point? So, of course, you may get information from the community that might be a little bit hyperbolic, that there's, oh my God, I heard there is. And I think the board always has the opportunity to reach out to the superintendent and say, I'm hearing that there's been, 95 kids who went home today with the flu in, Vales Gate. We can clarify those for you upon request. I just don't know as a blanket expectation. That's kind of the point I was trying to clarify.
yeah, the verbiage in here was that if a board member was to be aware of a situation, we would reach out to administration.
Mr. Bergarelli?
Eight-hour thing. Thank you. I forgot all about that button. Tying us to the 48-hour thing. Is that something realistic that the administration sees is a problem? in addition to what I initially said, which probably wasn't caught on mic, was, is this a recommended change? Does the administration recommend this change, approve this change?
I see no problem with the time frame.
Ms. Peterson?
I think another thing that Mr. Baird also didn't mention that I think is important for the board to know, many times when it comes to some of the communicable outbreaks, we are not the people that kind of notify. The Department of Health and local health facilities are the ones who determine that there may be a breakthrough case. So it's almost as if they're sharing information with us to protect the school district. So sometimes that's not it's not something that we communicate because the Department of Health is telling us to take precautions under their guidance.
Ms. Boucher?
That is true. I just want to confirm that that is true, that most of the reporting comes from DOH to the prospective people. Again, because how often do you know if a kid is out with the flu? You really don't know until they come back to school that they had the flu. So most of those come from the doctor's office to the Department of Health because they have to be reported.
Oh, you have a question? Go ahead, Mr. Baird.
Just with regard to the 48-hour rule, I think what was mentioned before was timing's everything. Sometimes, I think the example given was if something happens late Friday, you may not have the personnel available to you to investigate until that Monday, and then we would exceed that 48-hour period. So I just thought there was some conversation previously about, is there any wiggle room when those events occur? So again, we may not know the facts as they occurred until Monday afternoon, which would exceed almost 72 hours by then. And if you have a holiday that, you know, like a Memorial Day, I just think there should be some flexibility. I leave that to the board.
Yes, I'm just.
I'm okay with I'm okay with it saying school days, because if something happens on a Friday night, again, if they get information about it, let's say it's 9 o'clock at night, which it happens, we know that.
Yes.
What caused us to even ask for this was that we basically don't want to see it on a news broadcast or read it in the newspaper before we're informed. That was the purpose of the 48 hours. So, Ms. Boucher?
Again, when it comes to specifically communicable diseases, in my profession, 10 out of 10 times you're going to see it on the news before you see it come from anywhere close to home. So when it comes to the communicable diseases, I can agree with that. Again, if there's an incident, and I can attest to this as a board member, we get emails all the time about things that happened that day. So I don't believe the administration is not saying something, but in this specific policy, it's saying major incidents involving the district. So I think that, again, if something happens or someone's privy to that information on a Friday night, it's not going public. People talk in the community. It's hard to say people are not going to talk. That happens all the time. So I think from an administration board level, we do have to hear the recommendations to say what they can plausibly do.
So what's your pleasure with this? Are we going to move it forward? Oh, Mr. Bergerelli, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Madam President. The problem with your statement before, you don't want to see in the news before we hear about it from the board, with everyone with a cell phone in their pocket and everyone with an Instagram account and a Facebook account, this is going to be plastered all over before the district has enough real time to find out what really happened. So if you prefer to have half of the information before it's on the news, I would rather have a full picture of what's going on to the extent, you know, legally possible, because we're never going to be able to beat the kid with the cell phone in his pocket to post it out there. People are always going to know before the news does, or before we do, unfortunately, at times.
Well, the issue with that is that, you know, with the last incident, you know, we had, I don't know if you did, but I had people from the media calling me and asking me, and I wasn't aware of anything, and it's I just refer them, you know, to call, you know, call the clerk or.
And that's the proper action to take.
I know, but it's, It's just not a good look when the board isn't aware that something, we don't need the full details, we don't need that, we just need to know that something transpired. Ms. Peterson?
So I think in the past, I know that this was brought up, and I think the 48 hours, we did say that we do notify the board when something's happening, or an incident has occurred. The 48 hours, depending upon the incident, how fast social media moves. It's not that we don't want to make everyone aware, but then there's certain details that we cannot share. I don't think that we had a concern about the notification because that's our practice. We notify when there is something that does happen. I think our concern was definitely about the Department of Health notification because of the parameters that were put under legally by the Department of Health. But I think what our concern was also the time frame depending on how it falls. Sometimes we can share that something happened, but we don't have any details. And we have done that, and it's at sometimes seen that we're holding back information, but we can share what we have at the time and, then go into greater detail at a later time.
Victoria?
If I could propose then the window of time being 48 to 72 hours, because it gives you that window of time. If it happens on a Friday, 72 hours is a Monday.
Okay.
You okay with that?
Mr. Bergarelli, are you good with that?
No, I don't want to lock us down to any time. I think they've done a sufficient job. My son was at the school when the shots were fired. He called me. Within 5 minutes, we got an email. So, I don't know what incident you're talking about.
So what's the pleasure of the committee?
I would like to bring it to the board for a vote.
And I'll second that.
With those changes.
Roll call. Victoria?
Yes.
I'm a yes.
No.
Mr. Bergarelli is no. Next up on the agenda is agenda preparation and dissemination, policy 2342. This policy just basically adds the vice president to agenda setting meetings and the deputy superintendent, can be invited. Any questions? No. Okay, can I have?
Sorry.
Okay.
It wasn't, because the changes aren't highlighted, so I had to read it a little bit. So it is the vice president in their stead, so it's not the president and vice president, and it's not superintendent and deputy superintendent, correct? It's taking the place of if one is not available, correct?
Victoria?
So I think that all four parties should be invited in.
I agree.
So I would like it to be an invitation to the vice president and the deputy superintendent.
Is that okay with the administration?
Dr. Bourne, did you have a comment?
I do not.
Can I have a motion to move this forward?
Well, in this policy, it says in their stead. We can take that out? Okay. So with that modification, I would like to move it to the board for a vote.
I'll second. And roll call? Victoria?
Yes.
I'm a yes. Mr. Bergarelli?
Yes.
Okay, great. The next policy is 2320, special meetings. This policy basically just added a definition for the special meetings. Any questions? Mr. Bergarelli?
Thank you. This is, again, these changes are just make it in line with already NISBA policy, is that correct?
Yeah, well, in line with open meetings, yes.
David?
These were not in the NISBA policy. These were requested by members of this committee.
But are they consistent with open meetings laws?
Yes.
Thank you.
I make a motion to move it forward for a vote.
Second.
Victoria, roll call. Victoria?
Yes.
I'm a yes. Mr. Bergarelli?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay. All right. Moving on. Next policy, 6150 budget transfers. It basically reduces the amount of transfer from $200,000 without board approval to $50,000. Any questions? Mr. Bergarelli?
Dr. Vaughn, how will this hinder day-to-day operations, from your opinion?
I do not see this as being a hindrance.
Victoria?
I believe Mr. Shaw actually had like a symposium where you discussed budget transfers that I attended. Can you talk to what the normal amount would be for a small city school district?
There is a bit of a range. There would be more of a need to have a bigger number later in the year, because if you have budget lines that are flush, you shouldn't be expending those lines. As you get towards April, May, or June, there might occasionally be a need to transfer out of a line. 50,000 would not be an unusual number for a small city district, and you're never more than 24 hours away from a quick board meeting to approve a transfer.
Ms. Peterson?
So when we discussed this before, we went back and we looked, that was one of the things, I think this was brought previously, and it, we looked at the transfers that we had to date, and there were only about maybe 9, and of those 9 that were brought to the board. So there weren't as many transfers, but we did note that towards the latter part of the year, there would probably be more based on what we reviewed last year. So this time, this is fine.
Can I have, I'll make
Motion
a,
to bring it to the board for a vote.
okay, a second, and roll call. Victoria?
Yes.
Mr. Bergarelli? Yes. And I'm a yes. Thank you. Okay, moving on. The next policy is 2120.2, voting procedures. Okay. This policy basically just added early mail ballots
Military ballots.
and military ballots.
That's for law, correct?
Yes. It just didn't make sense to only have absentee ballots, because now you have early mail ballots, and for a few years, you've also had military ballots.
So I make a motion to move this forward for a vote?
Second.
And, oh, sure.
Because it's not highlighted, the military ballots portion that changed, what changed then? Because nothing's highlighted here.
There was nothing. There was nothing in your policy about military ballots or the early mail ballots, so that I added it.
Because it's not in red, so that's why I was wondering. Thank you.
Oh, it is in my version, sorry. You have to print it out in color.
Okay, so we made a motion. Roll call. Victoria?
Yes.
And I'm a yes. Mr. Bergarelli? Great, thank you. Okay. The next policy, okay, we did that. The next policy are the NISBA suggested policies, the 2000 policies, or a portion of them. Did anyone have any questions on any of those?
Madam President?
Mr. Bergarelli?
I see the change here. The only thing I saw change was the clause striking the attorney part. Is that because we do not indeed have a school attorney?
What policy was that, Ray? Do you know?
Which
That's
policy?
the annual organizational meeting, and it just talks about the bonding of the school attorney. We don't get bonded. That's the only reason I removed it.
So,
Mr. Bergarelli, would you like to see the one, these are in color, you might be able to see it better? Oh, you have it, okay.
The military changes are not in color in what we were given.
Oh, okay.
Unless I was given something different than anything else. No, I have this. Everything else I see. Thank you.
Ms. Peterson?
2210, so it is the bonding, so she did say that, but I was wondering if that also talks about, because it's talking about handling district funds too, so that's, which I know in some instances you do handle if we have settlements or something.
To find it.
No? Okay.
And the deputy claims auditor was also added so that you have a deputy claims auditor.
Any other questions? Okay. Can I have a motion to move these forward for,
So moved.
and I'll second. Roll call, Victoria?
Yes.
Mr. Bergarelli?
Yes.
And I'm a yes. Thank you. Okay. All right, next. Okay. The next is a draft. We'll go for a first reading on this policy to include a student on, as an ex officio member of the board. And I believe this begins in July. It's state mandated.
Yeah, I actually took out the superfluous, the language that's, I just thought it would be easier for you to read it.
Oh, great.
And I also took out the one piece where you can't have the person who is appointed as the ex officio member elected by the student body. That doesn't apply to small city school districts. You'll see, this should be easier to read.
You said it does not apply?
Yes, yes,
some of
there's
it.
just one little, you see now, number 2 in the different,
Victoria?
Is there any reason we can't do this sooner than July?
you have to make some decisions before you can do it.
Okay.
What specific decisions we have to make?
You have to make a decision about who will decide how many student ex officio student board members you want to have, number one. You have one NFA, but you do have 3 different buildings, so I don't know if you would want to have one from each, or, you know, that's a decision. Also, the process for determining who will be the student board member. There are varying options.
Okay, I have a question.
Yes.
Will these students be insured?
They don't have voting rights. They don't participate in executive sessions. They're not privy to confidential or sensitive material. They are just basically to be a conduit between the student body and the board in the interest of the district. And it's now required by law, but then they don't need to have insurance.
Okay, thank you. So Should we put this forward for a first,
Well, you can't put it forward in this specific manner. You have to decide what it is you want to do. Here, there are some optional provisions in here. And what's required is that the student ex officio board members are entitled to sit with the board at public meetings and public hearings. They can speak on issues. They can give a report to the board on things that are going on in the schools, if you would like them to do that. They cannot attend executive session. They cannot vote. They don't make part of a quorum. They can't get any money. You can ask them to participate in training. You can also decide whether or not you want them to come. You're going to make it mandatory for them to come during the summer months, July and August, which most districts are not doing because they may not even be around.
okay.
So
So shouldn't we bring it to the board for a first read then? So they,
I think you should discuss it.
So I want to discuss this now, if we can. So I think it's very important to have actual students that are in the building talk at board meetings. And the reason I say that is because they get the firsthand view of what happens every day. We get bits and pieces, things get messed up in messages. Having students, and in my opinion, I believe since we have 3 high schools, there should be 3 representatives, 1 from each school. That's my opinion. So can we have the discussion about it?
I would support that, for 1 from each. Mr. Bergarelli?
They already have student council there. Each grade has senators, vice president, treasurer, all that. So, I definitely agree it should be a student from each school, and they already have the people elected. So amongst themselves, I imagine it would be pretty easy to decide, or at least a small enough pool for them to decide who should be the representative from each school. I don't know how West and North do their voting in comparison to Maine, though. I don't know.
Well, these are the ways of deciding who will be selected. It can be the student president of the high school, selected by the high school student government, selected by the high school principal, selected by actually, it can't be. They're selected by the superintendent of schools or selected by a majority vote of the Board of Ed. However the person is selected, they will be appointed by the board after they are selected. So that's a discussion item as well.
So
And then it would probably be, I don't know if all of the schools will use the same process. You can have a procedure or a regulation that describes the process. And many schools require them to apply for the board seat, and you can also establish qualifications and parameters if you want to in a regulation. This is just basically what's in the law.
Victoria?
I was first.
Ms. Peterson?
I think perhaps, I know that however the board decides on how they're going to choose and what, but I just think in order for a student to be prepared to participate, they may need some guidance in that. And I know Canarian Council, as a person that was on Canarian Council and government, our advisor would probably advise, and when I was in government, we advised our student member of our board. So sometimes you want to prep them a little so they also know what they're getting into. So suppose you say it's going to be the class president, and the class president is a 3-sport athlete that is super involved. This may not be a selection for them. However, a student that maybe isn't as involved but is really interested in government, maybe a student that may be a treasurer in that group but is more interested in this type of. So I think that the board really needs to think about those type of flexibility when we're selecting, and there should definitely be input from the high school principals and the superintendent in terms of who sits on, but also just some time for a student to understand what their commitment is going to be. That is a year-long commitment, that it is going to be at night, like all of those things, because school, they're high school students, they have busy schedules, they need to understand the commitment before they agree to it. Because we want an active, whoever the students are, how many we choose, you want an active person to be able to participate So we should have all of those parameters kind of spelled out for them.
And it doesn't have to be a senior. It can be anyone who's has been one of the high school buildings for at least 1 year, which means it can be a sophomore, junior, or senior.
Victoria?
How do we feel about them having an election of their own? For the kids?
Yeah, they have elections every year.
No, I mean, but specifically to be an ex officio board member.
For that completely, then maybe have whatever class advisors are attached to them signing off on those students, and it should be a president and a vice president type thing here. So that way, in lieu of one, because they are play sports, dance, whatever, you know, my kid's there, so he has that issue all the time. He can't make some things, so. And then for the two schools, if they do not have a representative, then do they have an election specifically in each campus for the position?
I think we also, like Onyx just said, we have to be very vocal about what this entails, because,
They have to.
You know.
No, this is.
right, so we would have to figure out a way,
You're here and.
yeah, for us as a board to convey that to the students. So I think we should probably still
We can
continue to
invite
discuss it.
prospective candidates, people that'd be interested maybe to come into a couple board meetings just to watch, and then decide in your schools, you know, and then maybe implementing after July 1st would be a better idea, because we have time for them to go through all this and see it.
I agree.
I hope they don't have to get up early in the morning.
They don't have to stay for the full meeting. They're entitled to sit with the board and attend the meetings, but you can allow them to go if, you know, they may have work. You can also have more than one from each building, so you can have an alternate in case. So there are lots of things to talk about and decide. And this is not in any shape to go to the board for you know, for a first read unless we know what the parameters will be. So either we'll have to make some decisions and present it to the board, or you may want to have a discussion with the board and then come back to the next meeting and prepare a policy that's ready.
So are we going to move it to the board for discussion? To the full board for discussion, or Victoria?
So I think that at the next agenda setting, we should discuss having this as a discussion under the president's item. We can discuss it as a board.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Ms. Peterson?
I think that, you know, perhaps Dr. Bourne, she may want to also speak with the principal. She may want to submit a proposal to you, because that may help in the decision-making process.
We can discuss it at agenda setting, that's fine.
Okay, so we're just going to discuss this at agenda setting and then decide whether to put it on the agenda for discussion. Okay. I'm going to mark this discussion. Okay, moving on. Next policy is a draft of a policy regarding coaching. This was actually a suggestion by a thoughtful community member that communicated with a board member, and I thought it was quite good. But
Yes.
does anyone have any questions? Ms. Boucher?
Can anyone from administration, going off of what this says, kind of talk about any duplicates that we already have in the code of conduct or the athletic code of conduct or the coach's code of conduct?
There is some duplication. There's definitely coach responsibilities that are in the handbook, so there is some duplication.
Okay.
Some of these things are possibly valid.
Okay. Okay.
I'd like to make a motion to go to executive session to discuss this.
I'll second. Roll call, Victoria?
Yes.
I'm yes. Mr. Bergarelli? Okay.
15 minutes? Is that good? Okay.
Okay, Mr. Shaw, you want to explain the draft policy that we just discussed?
Yes, there were some legal questions about a proposed policy as it related to coaching, decision-making. And the first aspect was the gathering of information to inform who should be the coaches. And that's something that will be addressed through collective bargaining, since the teacher's contract contains the coaching positions, and almost all of your coaches are teachers. So that will be addressed accordingly. There is an issue regarding the timely hiring and approval of coaches, and this is something which may be addressed between the board and the acting superintendent, and the timing of putting out the positions, and all of them are annual. No one has a tenure right in a coaching position, so you may be hearing from the acting superintendent in the ensuing months, and possibly to post all of them for all seasons in the late spring. About coaching responsibilities, this is a job description issue, and also this is covered largely in coaching handbooks, so that's something that can be administratively reviewed, and if there are to be any changes made, that'll come back the way the board. There was also a question raised about anti-bullying training, and that's a mandate for all of your faculty, which includes the coaches, and that's done annually. And that pretty much is what the board needed to discuss vis-a-vis potential policy and how it might be addressed.
Okay, so the next policy is policy 0110.2, workplace sexual harassment. And I'll just turn this over to Mr. Shaw to explain this to us.
Okay, Madam President, there are a couple of policies that have to be considered together and certain actions taken. So right now, there are two Title IX policies. Neither of them are compliant given the recent change in administrations. And in one way, it's back to the future. So policy 0111 and the current policy 9471, both Title IX policies, need to be repealed and replaced with the proposed policy entitled Title IX Sexual Discrimination Policy for Employees. And this policy is modeled after what the Office of Civil Rights Attorneys for the Department of Education Federal had informed districts under the 2020 Title IX regulations, as opposed to the 2024 Title IX regs that were stricken down by a court in, I think it was in Kansas. So we're suggesting that you bring before the board, actually for adoption on first reading, what would be the new policy 9471, and to repeal the old policy 9471 and policy 0111. Now, policy 0110.2 includes procedures that are to be applied both to Title IX, to Title VI, and to Title VII investigations. So Title IX is sex and gender. Title VI deals with ethnicity and religion. Title VII deals with discrimination in employment. So the procedures to follow for investigation and reporting for all of those are embodied in 0110.2. So the proposed modifications to that policy are to make it clear that its procedures do not apply to Title IX because that is going to be governed by the newly adopted Title IX sexual discrimination policy for employees. And also internally, there's a proposed change under the appeal procedure to indicate the situation where a superintendent is either a complainant or a respondent, and right now the appeal would go to the superintendent from their own complaint or being a respondent to a complaint. So that's a pretty typical provision in policies. I think that's it.
So it'll go to the board, not the superintendent.
Right, so, right, if it involves the superintendent, it'll go to the board rather than to the superintendent.
Okay. So can I have a motion to move these forward?
So moved.
And I'll second. And any questions on these? No? Victoria?
So just to confirm, this is going for a first read and adoption.
Yes.
Right. Okay, so roll call. Victoria?
Yes.
I'm a yes. Mr. Bergarelli? Yes. It's
Motion to adjourn.
a second. Roll call. Victoria?
Yes.
I'm a yes. Mr. Bergarelli?
Yes.
Thank you for watching.